Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. If you're familiar with my channel, you've heard about the argument for the resurrection of Jesus, and typically this is used as an argument for the truth of Christianity. But what about arguments for other religions like Islam and Judaism and Buddhism and Hinduism? Well, that's what we're going to be exploring in this interview. I'm very delighted to be joined by Dr. Sam Lebens, a professor of philosophy at the University of Haifa. So welcome, Sam.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to be joined by you because you've published this brand new book. It's hot off the press, and it is called Philosophy of Religion, The Basics.
Yeah.
And I've only read this one chapter so far, but this chapter was really good, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the book. We're going to be discussing chapter 4, Arguments for Specific Religions. Before we get into that chapter, let me just first ask you, what led you to write this book?
Well, the long and short story is that have you ever had Hudson on your show?
No, he doesn't do interviews like this.
He's such a fabulous philosopher and great Christian philosopher. Truth is, he was asked by Routledge to write this book, and he said no, but I know someone who'll write it. And he put my name forward. It's part of a series, Routledge, The Basics, right? So they've got in all sorts of different fields, and they wanted somebody to write an introductory book to the philosophy of religion. And I was lucky enough to be invited to do it. And it's a tall order because you're trying to introduce an entire field, the philosophy of religion. You want to do it in a way that's not going to put people off if they're, so you're going to have readers who are Christian, you're going to have readers who are atheists, you're going to have readers coming from all other different religions as well, and to try and give a friendly, accessible introduction that doesn't, my biases come across from time to time, but my hope is that I create a conversation that's kind of accommodating to lots of different viewpoints. So that was what I tried to do.
Yeah. Well, in this chapter, I know at various points you say, perhaps this is my bias coming through at this point. So you try to identify I'm sympathetic to this argument. But I appreciate that. I thought that was good.
Yeah.
I felt like you treated the argument for the resurrection fairly, and that's coming from a Christian. So I appreciate it.
Sure. Well, no, it's a very interesting argument. And I think a lot of introductions to the philosophy of religion, they try to stay at a very general level. So they'll give you arguments for the existence of God, and they don't, or things about the nature of religion or religious experience or whatever. They don't, or the problem of evil, so arguments against God. They don't tend to go to this sort of area that we're discussing here, chapter 4 of my book, which is arguments for specific religions. And I think that the argument about the resurrection is a particularly interesting argument for Christianity. Not the only argument that could lead a person to the Christian faith, of course, but a particularly interesting one.
Yeah. Well, let me say this to the viewer. I have really exciting news for those who are watching. So Routledge was kind enough to send me 2 free copies of the book, and I'm going to give these away to the viewers, 2 of you. And you have to stick around until the very end of the interview to hear how you can win a free copy. Okay.
Fabulous.
So I'll give you that story later. All right, let's go ahead and begin. So the chapter, I didn't put this in my questions that I sent to you, but I think it's important. You mentioned at the very beginning of the chapter that their belief is not the only requirement. If it is a requirement at all, that can be contested, whether belief is required. for faith.
Yeah.
But it seems like for many religions, faith is a requirement. I'm thinking here of Christianity.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And of course, there are some Christians who would say belief is a requirement for Christianity,
sure.
but it's actually more complicated than it seems, because the relationship between faith and belief is complicated, as you're alluding to. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you say at the beginning of the chapter that it's important that whatever arguments we end up offering, try to capture, I think I'm getting this right, they try to capture that idea that you might go beyond just belief and try to enter into an actual faith commitment, maybe living a certain way, following a certain set of religious practices and so on.
That's right. I mean, formally, to be convinced that a religion is true might not be sufficient to become religious. You know, in the New Testament, there's this idea that Satan believes in God, right? But that doesn't make him, you know, an exemplar of religiosity. So there's much more to religion than just belief. The arguments of chapter 4, apart from the very last one, focus only really on belief, right? You know, what reasons do we have for believing that a religion might be true, or that its core claims might be true? But the point you're alluding to is an important point that I make at the beginning of the chapter, that actually, for most of us, believing in a religion is not enough, and it might not even be necessary, because faith might be enough. Right?
Yeah. All right. So with that said, let's look at Christianity first, okay? Mm-hmm. So let me put this slide on the screen. All right. For Christianity, here's what I'll do. I'll read out the argument, and then you can walk us through how a Christian might defend each premise and some of the objections to the argument and so on.
Sure.
So premise 1, Jesus was resurrected 3 days after dying. Premise 2, if Jesus was resurrected 3 days after dying, then Christianity is true. So Christianity is true. Now that's the argument.
That's the argument. Now, I'm an Orthodox rabbi, so people might be surprised by this argument. You know, Sam Lebens is endorsing this argument. I don't actually endorse the conclusion personally, but I find the argument very interesting. Right, so it's clearly a valid argument. Okay, and your listeners, because you are the analytic Christian, so your readers, your listeners probably know this already. But a valid argument is any argument that has the following feature. It needs to be such that if its premises are true, then its conclusion follows, right? And this argument has that feature. So lines 1 and 2 are the premises. And if both of those statements are true, lines 1 and 2 of this argument, then it would seem that 3 follows, right? It's valid. So the question is it sound? Right? A sound argument is a valid argument whose premises are true, right? So the atheist, the non-Christian, everyone can accept that this argument is valid. The really hot question, the kind of controversial question, is whether this argument is sound.
So based on my reading of the chapter, you have reasons for rejecting both 1 and 2. So, but before you get into why you reject it, why don't we try to motivate the premise? Yeah.
Good.
So say why might somebody accept 1 and 2?
Good. I'm a positive person. I think that also whenever you see an argument in philosophy, even arguments you disagree with, I think it's really important to try and get your head into the space of the people putting the argument forward and figure out why might someone think this, right? And some philosophers who I admire tremendously believe both of these premises, right? And they have reasons for that. Okay. So as I understand it, the reasons for thinking the first premise are true are based on testimony, okay? First-hand accounts of, and of course, second-hand accounts, but accounts of people who went to inspect his tomb, for example, 3 days after he died, and the tomb was empty, famously. There were people who reported seeing him and having conversations with him after he had reportedly died, been dead for 3 days. And the case for thinking the first premise is true is based on thinking that these sources, of testimony are trustworthy sources, right? So if you believe that you have, robust, trustworthy historical testimony to the fact of Jesus's death and resurrection, then you're going to think that premise one is true. But there's a more so far so uninteresting. I think there's a much more interesting reason for thinking that one is true. And I actually think that for the people who are convinced by this argument, this is doing a lot of the work. Okay, is that whenever you want to know whether something is true based on the evidence, right? One of the questions you should ask yourself is, well, how likely did you think it was before you even started looking for evidence? Okay, because if a claim is very, very likely true already, you simply need less evidence, right? For a really unlikely claim, if you want to convince me that something really implausible is true, you're going to have to give me much more evidence than if you want to convince me that something I half expected was true anyway, and you tell me that it was true. I'm going to demand less evidence. So Richard Swinburne, for example, thinks that, and here I agree with him, thinks there's very, very good reason to believe that there's a God, that God created the world, right? And with Swinburne, I think we do have very good reasons to believe in the existence of God. There is a chapter on arguments for the existence of God in the book. I try to be as non-partisan as I can, so I don't necessarily blow the trumpet of these arguments as strongly as I might if I was writing my own kind of, Sam Lebens' opinions on things. But I think there's a very, very good reason for believing in the existence of a God and a personal God. Swinburne then goes further and says, well, if you do believe that there's a God, then it's very likely that that God at some point in history would want to become incarnate. Okay. Now, this is where I'm less convinced than Swinburne about that. But let's again hear his arguments. So he thinks that, first of all, if God wanted to teach us how to live, then he'd do a much better job of that by becoming incarnate, by becoming a person of flesh and blood, and then setting an example for us to follow. In fact, I think there's this whole idea, the book of John begins with how in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God. Well, John was Jewish. And in the Jewish faith, there's this idea that the Torah, Jewish law, revelation, God's wisdom, it pre-existed the creation, right? It's what speaks in Proverbs chapter 8, right? The wisdom that speaks, that was with God before the world was created. In Jewish thought, so to speak, that wisdom became flesh in the ink and parchment of the Torah. Right, it became flesh, but not in human form. It became embodied in a book. And I suppose the Christian claim and the claim that moves Swinburne here is that wasn't sufficiently vivid. You can have a book and it tells you how to live, but unless you see it in the flesh, kind of lived out. So the idea is that Jesus comes to embody the law of Moses, but quite literally embody this wisdom that is the Logos in Christian theology, the second person of the Trinity. So that's one reason for thinking God might become incarnate. I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea, by the way. I think that I think there may be issues with incarnation. Is it the sort of thing that's even logically possible for a God to become incarnate? If he could, then maybe he should become a man and a woman and a child and an old person and all these different, to give multiple examples. But I've got no problem with the argument so far. We might expect that at some point God will become incarnate. I say I have no problem. I'm shelving the logical problem.
Yeah.
Okay. But Swinburne thinks there's another reason. He actually gives three, but I'll focus on what I think are the two most powerful and most important. Is that if we believe in God, and we do have good reason to believe in God, then we should also think that we owe God a tremendous amount, not least because first of all, he made us, right? But not least because we very often violate what seems to be the conditions of our creation because we sin, right? So in sinning, we accumulate an even greater debt to God than we would have had, without sinning. And the question is, well, what can we give God that isn't already owed to him? And Swinburne's answer is that the only gift we could give to God, the only thing we could sacrifice to God is God himself, because it's the only thing, so to speak, not owed to God. So if God wanted to give us the ability to atone for our sins and to atone perfectly for our sins, it would be a good idea for God to become incarnate so as to become a possible vehicle for our atonement. Okay. Now, again, I'm going to shelve for the moment, unless you want to come back to it, Jordan, the reasons why I'm not convinced, why I think that there are other equally plausible ways for God to grant human beings atonement. I just want to say this. If you think the things I've said so far are plausible, are sensible, then we should probably well expect that at some point in time, someone, God will become incarnate and he'll die for our sins, right? So then the question is, how much evidence do you need for that? How much evidence do you need of any given candidate for being God incarnate that he or she really was God incarnate? Well, if you don't think God exists, you'll need loads of evidence, right? Because you don't even believe that's possible. What do you mean, right? It would take a lot of evidence. If you think God exists, you'll need less evidence. If you think God exists and he's very likely to become incarnate at some point, then you'll need even less evidence. In fact, Swinburne makes a point. I kind of mock it a little bit, but it's actually, I regret that. I repent and I hope that I'll get atonement because it's not such a silly idea. The idea is that it was probably only in first century Israel. That was probably the first period in human history in which God could have become incarnate and it would have been understood as serving the purposes we're talking about. Because the purposes we're talking about require some quite sophisticated theology already. And how sophisticated is your theology? Swinburne says, well, first century Israel is about the first time when theology was sufficiently sophisticated for this to be well understood. So then you need even less evidence, so how much evidence do you need that somebody in first century Israel is God incarnate? So, of course, Swinburne knows that there's a possibility that the testimony we have about Jesus's resurrection was forged or there was some kind of hoax, a witting hoax or an unwitting hoax. There are all sorts of possibilities, skeptical possibilities. But as I said to you earlier, if you're half expecting something to be true already, it's legitimate to require less evidence. And since he's got reason to think that God is going to become incarnate and die for our sins at some time, and he thinks, by the way, that, God would be kind of very deceptive if he allowed an exemplary human life to take place and then to allow a super miracle like the resurrection to become associated with that human life if that human wasn't God incarnate, given that we were expecting it, right? So putting all of these things together, he thinks the evidence that we do have is sufficient for belief in the first premise of the argument. And okay, so there's no secret between you and me, Jordan. I'm not a Christian philosopher, so I don't endorse this argument. But I think the considerations I've given you are decent considerations for taking the first premise of the argument seriously. And I think the second argument, Swinburne doesn't put as much argumentative effort into defending the second premise because it just seems kind of obviously true, right? The argument he does say, and I've already kind of, I'm repeating myself, but he does say that it would be very deceptive of God to allow someone like Jesus to be resurrected if he wasn't actually God incarnate, given our expectations. And I think, it's relatively uncontroversial that if Jesus was God incarnate and died for our sins, then Christianity under some sorry. Then Christianity, under some interpretation or other, I'm not going to get into whether it's Catholic or Protestant or Pentecostal or Methodist or Baptist, but Christianity in some kind of broad brushstrokes is true if Jesus really was God incarnate who died for our sins. Islam thinks that Jesus was a prophet, but doesn't think that he was God incarnate who died for our sins. And Judaism obviously, doesn't believe that he was a prophet at all. So this is a strong argument, okay? And if you have good reasons for believing in the first premise, I think you almost automatically have good reasons for believing in the second premise. If you believe in the conjunction of the two premises, you get the conclusion.
All right. Let me mention this. So you gave some reasons that someone might reject premise one.
Yeah.
If they don't think they're good arguments for God, that's a good reason to reject.
That's already good. That's always a good. That's already
good. If they don't think that there's very good reasons that God would become incarnate.
Yeah. Then I think you might demand more evidence. You might be willing to be more skeptical about the testimonial evidence that we do have, right? How do I know? People can be confused and whatever, and it's been this many thousand years. And if you don't believe in God, certainly, and if you do believe in God, but you've got reasons not to expect him to become incarnate, right? You might think it's not possible for God to become incarnate. You may think that it's just unnecessary, certainly to die for our sins. You might have some other explanation of how atonement works. So, and as you'll see, I hope we'll get to the last argument of the chapter. It's not my interest, actually. It's never has been my interest to convince people that their religion isn't true. So I don't really want to spend much time talking about, what I think is wrong with these arguments. I'll give you something. I do in a personal capacity. I do want people to believe in God, but beyond that, I'm perhaps less fussy. But I think for your audiences, what might be more interesting than my reason or reasons people might have for rejecting the first premise is actually, I think there are reasons to reject the second premise. Now,
I wanted you to mention that.
Yeah. Now that I think is more surprising. Okay, and I think this argument can be met, right? But I just want to kind of share it with you. It's kind of a counter argument to premise two. So the way the counter argument's supposed to work is you say, well, hold on a minute. Let's imagine that Jesus was resurrected after 3 days of being dead. Let's imagine even that we, at some point in time, we're expecting God to become incarnate, or we're expecting him to die for our sins. Does it automatically follow? Well, Swinburne thinks yes, because he thinks otherwise God would be accused of tremendous deception. But I point out that in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses prophesizes that there will be prophets in the future who are not true prophets. This is Deuteronomy 13, right, towards the beginning of that chapter, verses 3-4. And he says that these prophets will be able to generate signs and wonders, even miracles. And he says that if a prophet, it's actually a quite complicated legal system, Moses, the first Moses, not Maimonides, the biblical Moses. It's a quite complicated system that Moses is laying out for us in Deuteronomy. On the one hand, he is establishing a role for a person called a prophet, right? There are going to be prophets after Moses. And he even commands the Israelites to obey the prophets. And he says that one of the signs that a person is a prophet is their ability to perform signs and wonders, miracles. But he also says that the sign and the miracle that a prophet is able to perform is defeasible. Even if a prophet can do tremendous signs and wonders, if they then tell you to violate the laws of Moses, then you can know they're a false prophet. Now, you could push back on me, because a close reading of those verses, he doesn't say anything about the laws of Moses per se. It's about idolatry, other gods, right? But maybe, you know, Lords of maybe I'm reading too much into these verses. As I understand the verses, and I'll try and explain also why I read them this way. As I understand the verses, Moses is saying, now I'm going to read lots of medieval commentaries into this. This is what Moses is saying as understood by lots of medieval commentaries. Guys, you don't actually believe in me, Moses, just because of the miracles I did. Truth be told, in the book of Exodus, God actually gives Moses miracles to perform so that the Israelites all believe in him. But nonetheless, their faith in Moses didn't last very long, right? They were always waiting, you know. Mm-hmm. Moses is saying to the Jewish people, look, you guys don't believe in me because of the miracles I do. You believe in me for one reason, or one good reason, and one good reason only. All of you were standing at Mount Sinai, and all of you heard God speak to me. And that means you know of me that I'm a prophet in a much more vivid way than any other prophet, because you actually heard God speak to me. All of you, right? Men, women, children, you were there at Mount Sinai. I am telling you, based on my authority as a prophet, that you should listen to other prophets if they can do miracles and signs and wonders. But I'm also telling you that there will one day be prophets who can do signs and miracles. But signs and miracles on their own are not a good reason to believe that a person's telling the truth, because God may have sent this prophet to test you. So if a prophet comes to undo the laws of Moses, then unless there's like a second Sinai-like experience in which we all hear them speaking to God, it shouldn't matter if they can walk on water, feed 5,000, be resurrected from the dead. We've been told to expect you already, and you're a false prophet. So then, you know, I talk about how in the book of Matthew, chapter 5, Jesus perhaps preempts this by saying, look, I haven't come to undermine the law of Moses. So I'm not a false prophet. I haven't come to undermine the law of Moses. So that might be a part of a response. But I would point to Galatians and other places in which it looks like the law has been abrogated. That Jewish followers of Jesus no longer need to be circumcised. Jewish followers of Jesus no longer have to watch what they eat. The laws of Moses have been abrogated. And therefore, you know, if Jesus is teaching that, if the New Testament is a faithful, or if Jesus says, you know, there's no access to the Father other than through me, and depending on how you understand the Trinity, you know, is Jesus telling us to worship something other than the God that took us out of Egypt, other than the God that we worshipped prior to Jesus? So my attack on premise 2 goes something like this. You know, Swinburne says we had reason to believe that God would become incarnate, and that's why he takes the evidence that we do have for premise 1 very, very seriously. I'm suggesting that maybe Jews in the Second Temple period, Jews in the time of Jesus, actually had reason to expect that false prophets would come and that they could do miracles. So, you know, so that's my response. And I just want to be clear. I recognize how contentious this response is, because it requires a very specific understanding of the role of Mount Sinai, a very specific understanding of the institution of prophecy in the book of Deuteronomy, a very specific understanding of Jesus's relationship to the law of Moses. So it's not an ironclad response, but it's a response.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you and I could talk about that a lot more, but for the sake of time, we'll move on.
Sure. Okay. So I'm happy to talk about it another time. Yeah.
So that was an argument for Christianity.
Yes.
And I think my viewers will appreciate hearing what's interesting is you're an Orthodox rabbi. So that's a different sort of perspective on, I think a lot of times we're used to hearing like naturalistic or responses, something like that. But that's not quite what you're offering. You're coming from the perspective of an Orthodox rabbi. So I think they'll appreciate hearing that kind of different take on the argument for the resurrection.
I hope so. And I sincerely believe that especially when people share a faith in God, but even when we don't share a faith in God, you know, in cases when we're debating with sincere atheists, that the cut and thrust of debate just helps us to improve our own position. So, I hope that even those who do endorse this argument will welcome the challenge of the various responses I raise.
Yeah. Okay, so let's shift now to arguments for Islam.
Yes.
So just like last time, I'll read these out, the argument, and then you can motivate each premise and then raise the objections.
Sure. I'll try and move quicker.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I think my audience will appreciate that you spent a little more time on that one.
Yeah.
Okay, so premise 1, the Quran is inimitable. I think I'm saying that correctly.
Yeah, I think so too, yeah.
2, if the Quran is inimitable, then Islam is true. So 3, Islam is true.
Okay. I hope your viewers can see this is clearly a valid argument. Again, if 1 and 2 are true, then 3 trivially follows. The question, of course, is whether the argument is sound, whether premises 1 and 2 are both true. And the word that we're not sure how to pronounce, inimitable, that needs to be unpacked, right, to understand this claim. And various Muslims have, it seems to me, through looking through the literature, various Muslims have meant slightly different things when making the claim that the Quran is inimitable. The Quran itself raises this claim and raises it as a challenge. It says, if anyone doesn't believe in this book, you try and write a book that's like it. Well, the question is, what do you mean that's like it, right? There are some very trivial ways in which, of course, you could write a book that's like it. You could write a book that's in the same language. You could write a book that's about the same length. You could write, it's like it, right? Clearly means something richer than that. One claim that I'm just not well qualified to assess is a claim that some scholars of Arabic make, which is that the book is exquisitely beautiful in the original language in a way that is somehow uncanny. Some Muslim scholars say, if you get a native Arabic speaker and you put, one verse of the Quran next to 3 made up verses that you try to make them sound as Quranic as possible, the native Arabic speaker will always know, because there's some kind of literary quality had by the original Arabic that just, anybody else who tries to do it just can't, do it. Some reputable scholars of Arabic talk about how innovative the Arabic of the Quran was as compared to pre-Quranic Arabic, to such an extent that it's actually something of a marvel that the original listeners even understood what it was saying, because it's such a revolution in the language. Well, the problem is, I can't assess whether that's true or not. I don't speak Arabic, and if I ever did learn Arabic, I still wouldn't be a native speaker of Arabic. And so it's not like I think people are lying to me, but I've noticed that a lot of Jewish and Christian scholars of Arabic, they don't think this about the Quran, right? They even say quite disparaging things about its organization, about its meter, its rhythm, its rhyme, because it generally presents as a poem, but then, sometimes not. And Muslim scholars seem to think that these aspects which you or I might look at as bad organization just add to the mystery of the text. It's just very hard to find, we've all got implicit biases, so it's hard to find a neutral, okay. So there's another, I think, more promising way in which you could argue that the Quran is inimitable. And that's in terms of the effect that it has on its audiences, right? And I think there's a lot going for this. So, in the kind of more charismatic areas of Christianity, you see some amazing things happening in church, right? People will speak in tongues, or there'll be healings, or there'll be these quite remarkable things. Similar sorts of religious experiences are reported in the Muslim world very, very often around the reading of the Quran. So it's not in prayer, or it's in the reading of the Quran. Even people who don't understand the Quran, they get these ecstatic religious experiences in response to hearing the Quran. I would probably find it very hard to write a book that had that effect on anyone. I hope people like this book, but it's not going to do that to you, right? So yeah, try and write a book that does that. Here perhaps is an even better claim. You know, the New Testament and the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, are tremendously influential books, but it took them a very long time to build up the following that they have, right? This tremendous following that they have. The Arab populations of the Arabian Peninsula before the rise of Islam were basically illiterate nomads, right? And within decades, this book created a literary society and, you know, a global power, right? That, you know, Islamic philosophy, medicine, mathematics, art, and it was within decades, all seemingly in response to this book, right? Try and write a book that has that effect that quickly. Very, very hard, right? So I would go so far as to say there are probably some non-trivial senses in which you could make a very strong case for the first premise, right? The second premise is I think the one that's going to carry all the weight, right? Is that, okay, so it's inimitable, but there could be all sorts of natural explanations of its inimitability, right? Muhammad was unafraid of using the sword to spread his faith, right? If you have a very charismatic, powerful military leader, his books can sometimes, you know, I'm not going to try and sell this in those means, right? So
right,
it's not,
right.
You know,
I hope not.
You know, I really have no such plans. So you know, and I certainly don't want to offend any Muslim believers, but it just seems to me that there is a case to be made, a naturalistic case to be made for why the Quran was such, you know, a one-off historical literary production. And I think it was, right? But I think there are, as I say, naturalistic explanations. And I think similarly to my response to the Christian argument, the Christian and the Jew can both agree and say, do you know what? Even if there was something miraculous about the Quran, it still doesn't follow without further argument that Islam is true. Because you've got to think about, you know, well, what reasons might God have had for allowing the miraculous spread of Islam, if indeed you think the spread of Islam was miraculous? So, for example, Maimonides was of the opinion that Christianity and Islam were part of God's providential plan for humanity, because he thought it would pave the way for the Messiah eventually, because it would spread notions of monotheism, or it would spread. I imagine a Christian could say a similar thing. You know, at least Muhammad managed to spread monotheism to areas of the globe that had been untouched by even by Christianity, and maybe that paves the way for, you know, for something more accurate later on, which is you know, Christianity, if you're a Christian. Again, the point is the mere miraculousness of the Quran, like I was saying. Even if Jesus was resurrected, it doesn't follow without further ado that he was God incarnate. A similar thing, I think, can be said about the miraculousness of the Quran, if indeed you believe in its miraculousness, especially if you believe that, as Moses said, there will be false prophets who can do miracles.
Yeah. Okay. I think that was a good place to wrap up the argument for Islam. Now,
Yeah.
I'm really interested in, we can take a little bit more time on
Sure.
the argument for Judaism, because I want to hear from an Orthodox rabbi who's a philosopher. That's a great combo.
Yeah.
What an argument for Judaism would be. It seems like you are at least somewhat sympathetic to this argument.
Yeah, I am somewhat sympathetic to this argument. Like the argument for Christianity, I don't think it really works unless you're antecedently committed to the existence of God. So if I were an atheist, I wouldn't think this was a good argument at all. Once you've got theism in place, I think this argument is compelling.
All right, so I'm going to read it out like before, and then you
Sure.
can motivate the premises and raise objections. So premise 1, if it is a widespread belief among the Jews today that there was a revelation to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, then there was a revelation to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai.
Yep.
2, there is a widespread belief among the Jews today that there was a revelation to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. 3, if there was a revelation to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, then Judaism in some form or other is true. So, there was a revelation to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. That follows from lines 1 and 2. And the conclusion then is Judaism is true. That follows from lines 3 and 4.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, it's a slightly more complicated structure of an argument because it's got 3 premises, not 2 premises, and it's got 2 conclusions rather than 1 conclusion. But again, your educated and sophisticated listeners, I'm sure, will see straight away that the argument is valid. The question again is whether the argument is sound, and it's only sound if all 3 lines above, above that horizontal line, if all 3 premises are true. The first premise seems ludicrous, right? It's at a first shot, right? It literally says, well, if the Jews believe it, then it's true, right? Which is crazy. So there needs to be some background. This isn't a specific instance of a general rule. It's not the general rule that if people believe something, then it must be true, or if lots of people believe something, then it must be true. That's obviously not. It's not obviously not a general rule. This isn't an instance of a general rule. The general rule being something like when people believe something, it's true. That would be fallacious. There's supposed to be something more specific going on, less general. And this is known as the Kuzari principle. It's known as that because it comes from a medieval book written by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. The book was called the Kuzari. And the Kuzari principle says something like this. It says, if an entire nation believes that a national unforgettable occurred, then that belief is generally to be trusted. And then the question is, well, what's a national unforgettable? So it's something like an event that reputedly happened in the face of the entire nation. So it's not something that happened, in a cave, or something that happened to some small community, or even a relatively large community within the nation. It's something that happened to the entire nation. So perhaps, the German occupation of France is a national unforgettable because you couldn't have been in France and not known about it because it happened to all of France. A national unforgettable needs to be the sort of thing that we expect to generate an intergenerational chain of transmission, right? I could go even further. I could say a national unforgettable is a story that includes within the story the claim that it was always passed down from generation to generation, okay? So you've got it happening to an entire people and the story including this claim that it was passed down from generation to generation. Quoting my good friend and sometimes co-author Tyrone Goldschmidt, I give you a modern version of the Kuzari principle. It's like an improved version. He calls it the jumbled Kuzari principle, and his reason for doing that is because he's mixing in the thoughts of Rav Yehuda Halevi from this medieval Jewish text, but also some really important Christian thinkers. Most importantly here is Jonathan Edwards. He was a fabulous philosopher. I don't know if you've covered any of his work on your show before. So Goldschmidt's jumbled principle reads like this. A tradition is likely true if it is, 1, accepted by a whole nation, describes, 2, a national experience of a previous generation, an entire generation, of that nation, which 3 would be expected to create a continuous national memory until the tradition is in place, I would add, and they say it did, right? 4, that it's insulting to the nation, the narrative. For example, it says that they're stiff-necked and it lists their sins. 5, that the story itself makes universal, difficult, and severe demands on that nation. It says if a story meets all of those conditions and is widely believed by a nation about itself, then you can trust that it's probably true, right? It's good reason to think it's true. He gives a nice example. He says, imagine trying to convince the Nepalese that 300 years ago, Napoleon visited their country for 50 years and that everything he touched turned into gold, and that everyone he visited tried to molest him, so he put a curse on them, that their enemies will enslave them unless they fast once a week and tell their story to their children every day, and that they did tell this story to their children every day. Right? Try and convince the Nepalese that happened. They'd say, no, because you're telling me that my parents told me this story every day. They didn't tell me this story every day. Right? It would be very hard to fabricate the truth of such a story in such a way that you would be able to get an entire nation to believe it, right? So it's because the belief in the revelation at Sinai constitutes a national unforgettable that premise 1 is supposed to be true. Okay. If we move to premise 2,
I'll put it back on the screen here.
Sure. There is a widespread belief among the Jews today, right, that there was a revelation. And in fact, not just the Jews believe it. Christians and Muslims tend to believe it too. Premise 1, clearly controversial, right? Because it requires this notion of a national unforgettable. It requires this argument in the background. Premise 2, uncontroversial. Premise 3 is again going to carry a lot of weight because, of course, Christians don't believe that Judaism today, contemporary Orthodox Judaism is true, right? Muslims don't believe that contemporary Orthodox Judaism is true. And yet they do believe in the revelation at Sinai. So clearly they're rejecting premise 3. So then the question is, well, what reason might you have for accepting premise 3? Well, I'll give you my own personal reason for thinking that premise 3 is true. And again, I am not under any illusion that it's watertight or ironclad. This is philosophy, right? So my own reason for thinking that premise 3 is onto something is that I look at when and where the Sinai event occurred in the life of the Jewish people, right? So it happens after they have been rescued from slavery in Egypt, but before and immediately before, according to Plan A, immediately before they enter the land of Israel. Of course, Plan A doesn't materialize because of the sin of the 10 spies, and as a punishment, they're left to wander in the desert for 40 years. But according to Plan A, this happens, right before they go into the land of Israel, just after they've been made slaves. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that this is the moment in which the children of Israel, who are a motley collection of descendants of this person, Israel, Jacob, becomes a nation. They become a nation at this kind of, it's like the Constitutional Convention, right? It's when, under Mount Sinai, they get a law and the law binds them together and they become a people before they enter the land. And it seems to me, therefore, that this is a moment within the life of the Jewish nation. And I think of it, and I've written a lot about this in a previous work of mine called The Principles of Judaism, which sadly is so expensive that you would need to sell a kidney to be able to afford it. It's an academic book, Oxford University Press. But I argue in that book that God's appearance at Sinai was like a divine stamp of approval to the legal, religious, ritual literature that would tumble out of that moment. That's the 5 books of Moses, the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, Jewish law in general, that an omniscient God saw that, all of that happening, and by appearing at Sinai gave it a kind of seal of approval or authority. And because I see it as something that's happening internally to the Jewish people, or something that happens in the relationship between God and the Jewish people, then once a religion claims to be revealed to people outside of the Jewish nation, I think it's no longer getting its warrants from Sinai. It needs warrant from somewhere else, right? So Swinburne says it has warrant from somewhere else. It has warrant from the resurrection of Jesus, for example, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not walking into that particular debate right now. I'm just saying premise 3 strikes me as plausible, because I think that if a religion is no longer, unlike the early Church of Jerusalem, in the earliest days of Christianity, that really saw its primary mission being to the Jews, and it being an internal kind of religion within the Jewish people. Once Christianity had made a more decisive break with the Jewish nation, I think it can no longer claim to get its warrant from Sinai. Why? Because of the interpretation I've given that event in the life of the nation. So without even preempting you, and you're saying, yeah, but what are the arguments against this argument? One thing you could say is, oi, Rabbi Sam, you have misinterpreted what Sinai is all about, right? Sinai isn't, exclusively about things that happen internally to the Jewish people. It's about God and humanity, perhaps, and it's the first stage. So I'm not blind to the possibility of people attacking the third principle. It seems to me that Christians and Muslims alike should attack the third premise. The first premise, Christians, Muslims, and Jews can all accept, because we all believe that the revelation happened. It's going to be atheists who push back against the first premise. And actually, this is where I'm less sympathetic than others. Tyrone Goldschmidt at times seems to think the first premise is so convincing that even the atheists should be convinced. Mm-hmm. I don't think so. I think there are naturalistic explanations you could try to give as to how an entire nation came falsely to believe that all of them saw something and passed it down. I think that these naturalistic explanations are a little bit far-fetched, but they're no more far-fetched than the existence of God for an atheist. So you need to believe in God, I think, for the argument to get going.
Yeah, I would think my natural place to push back would be 3. When I first read the chapter, I thought, well, wait a minute. Christians,
I believe in
except that that revelation was given at Mount Sinai, but that doesn't mean that Judaism, to the exclusion of Christianity, is true. But
that's
I guess
point you make, Jordan. There have actually been some Christians and some Jews, like Franz Rosenzweig in the early 20th century, late 19th century, who have been dual covenant theorists, who thought that actually Judaism is somehow operative for Jews and Christianity is operative for Christians. And I can imagine such a Christian looking at this argument and saying, yeah, there was a covenant at Sinai and it's still binding on the Jews, but it doesn't, nothing to the exclusion of Christianity here.
Yeah,
I think that's a fair response. One second, I'm going to plug myself in.
As far as 1 goes, I need to think more carefully about it. I think there's something to that principle. My natural response may be like, from what I gather about the history of Israel, according to what archaeologists, historians say, like how this religion came to be formed. I don't know. There might be a story there where this belief evolves over time, and so eventually you get this sort of belief that the whole nation experienced this, but in reality, it wasn't the case that this was like the original belief, the belief we all started with. It reminds me that this won't be, I'm not saying it's like perfectly analogous. I can think of disanalogies, but it reminds me a bit of the Mandela effect. You know, the Mandela, so like
people
a widespread false belief that we all seem to remember. It's like, oh, I remember that happening. I wonder if, again, there can be disanalogies. I'm not saying that's a perfect pushback.
So the idea is that, look, the story itself as we have it today seems to meet all of the criteria of the jumbled Kuzari principle, right? The Mandela story doesn't meet all of them in the way this story does. The question is, does that make it more likely true than not true? And like you said, there are especially people who know a lot about the ancient Near East and how, you know, Judaism evolved into the stage it got to before Jesus in the Second Temple period, will say, no, there are naturalistic stories we could tell about how this belief, you know, evolved. I would just say a couple of things in response to that, if I may. The first is, we know of no time in which the Jewish people completely forgot about the story of the Exodus. So the Bible itself reports times when they were worshiping other gods, but that's because they believed in multiple gods, including the God of Abraham, but just there were others. You know, in the book of Kings, they find in the time of Josiah, they find this ancient text, and you know, everyone believes that it's legitimate. So you might think, well, these guys were credulous. They could, you know, it's so easy to forge something, but the text that they found wasn't telling them that they were at Mount Sinai. That was a national story that was already known and not forgotten, it seems to me. Also, I have my own reasons for being cautious, not irrevocably hostile, but cautious to a lot of the findings of biblical archaeology and source criticism about the authorship of the Bible itself, because I think that their science is underwritten by so many assumptions that theists should reject. And without necessarily getting into detail now, I would urge people to look at what Plantinga says in Warranted Christian Belief about biblical criticism and you know, why the methodology of biblical criticism, which leads you to isolate lots of different historical strata in the Hebrew Bible with lots of different authors, the methods with which biblical scholars came to those conclusions are methods that, according to Plantinga, and I agree with him, theists should be dubious of.
All right, so that wraps up the argument for Judaism. Now you have an argument. Well, you didn't put it in a form like we've been looking at, but you spend some time in the chapter arguing for the truth of Buddhism and Hinduism.
Yeah.
So can we do that now?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is harder. Look, you're the analytic Christian, and I have to tell you, analytic philosophy, when it does religion, analytic philosophy is in the history of philosophy, it's still relatively new, right? Philosophy starts with the pre-Socratics, and analytic philosophy starts maybe in the late 19th century. In the beginning, or at least quite soon after the beginning, analytic philosophy was pretty hostile to religion. And it took, ultimately, there were a few fits with some great Catholic philosophers, but it really took the rise of people like Plantinga, Peter van Inwagen, Eleanor Stump, the Adamses, that's Robert Adams and Marilyn McCord Adams, for analytic philosophy of religion to like flourish. And all of those thinkers have in common their Christianity, right? So if you try to give an introduction to analytic philosophy of religion, the temptation is to make it almost like an introduction to philosophy of Christianity, because the great practitioners have been Christian. I'm trying my own, on my own over here in Haifa with a friend in Jerusalem, my colleague Aaron Siegel, and a couple of other people dotted over the place. Don't want to name them all for fear of forgetting somebody. There's a very small number of Jews basically trying to emulate the rigor with which Christian philosophy has been undertaken in the last few decades. There are even fewer Muslims doing that. There are some, but there are fewer. Hindus and Buddhists, it's tough. And so it wasn't hard for me to find a Christian argument. It wasn't hard for me to find a Jewish argument, especially because I come from that tradition. The Muslim argument was slightly harder. It took me more work. In order to try and give the South Asian and the East Asian religions a kind of hearing in this chapter, I really had to stretch, and I found, not because there aren't great arguments, I'm sure there are many, but whether they've been kind of developed in ways that are characteristic of analytical philosophy. So what I did is I turned to a really interesting little book by a guy called Robert Griffith. Just want to make sure I got that right. 1 second. No, Robert Wright. Let's redo that. You'll edit it and it'll be seamless. What I did is I had to borrow basically from a really interesting little book by a guy called Robert Wright. And the book's called Why Buddhism is True. Now, Wright himself isn't an analytical philosopher, but he's a Western English-speaking academic who's kind of raised in an argumentative culture that is close enough to the discipline of analytic philosophy that I thought it would be interesting to include his argument. Hindus and Buddhists will rightly feel aggrieved that Wright himself collapses Hinduism and Buddhism into kind of one argument. His book is about Buddhism, and then at the end he says, oh, maybe this argument could apply to a form of Hinduism too. You're like, well, hold on a minute. Buddhism broke away from Hinduism for a reason. These are religions who are in many ways at odds with one another. But let me try and give you the basic form of what I take the argument to be. Okay. He says, he wants to say, we'll start with Buddhism and then we'll move into Hinduism. But he wants to say that science has revealed to us that Buddhism got two things importantly right. The first is its diagnosis of the human condition and basically what's wrong with us. Okay, that Buddhism has been vindicated in terms of getting the diagnosis of the human condition correct. And it's been vindicated scientifically in terms of Buddhism's prescriptions for how humans should respond to this problem and basically treat themselves of this malady that has been discovered. Okay. So let's take the first claim first, that Buddhism has kind of properly diagnosed the human condition or situation or what's wrong with the human condition. So first of all, not first of all, but I think first of all, for our purposes, he points to contemporary psychology that talks about something called the hedonic treadmill. And the basic idea is that we get stuck in really destructive, addictive behavior, cycles of addiction to unhealthy food or destructive patterns of behavior, to quick release pleasures. And that's why it's called the hedonic treadmill. And then the more you get used to these pleasures, the more you need of them to become satisfied. And you get into this cycle of addiction. And he thinks that this has been well diagnosed by contemporary evolutionary psychology because basically we evolved for life in Paleolithic Africa, where we were hunter-gatherers and where the threats were very real and there was all this need for flight or fright. We don't need many of those mechanisms anymore. And so they've started to kind of turn in on us and to kind of consume us. What's more, science has discovered, according to Robert Wright, that consciousness is not in the driving seat in the way that we thought it was, right? So we think of ourselves as like, we are these conscious beings who are in control of our bodies, and we have free will. We get to decide what we do with our bodies. No. Modern science has discovered, and he cites, for example, the famous Lebens experiments that seemed to indicate, I'll come back when we talk about why I don't think this argument works, but the Lebens experiments seem to indicate that your brain has already made decisions before the conscious self is aware of having made them, which makes it, and if that's true, that's a very shocking finding that could well lead you to believe that the kind of executive function of the conscious self is an illusion. It's not really that you're sitting there in control of your brain and your body. No, your brain kind of convinces you after the fact that you made the decision. You didn't make the decision, right? It was made, sub-personally. There's cognitive science points to the idea that you are, rather than kind of one conscious being, you're the product of all sorts of modules that are kind of interacting with one another. There's experiments on split brain patients, which also, pours doubt on the idea that there's this conscious self. And the more you study the sciences, Wright says, you find that you are less substantial than you thought you were, because you're in something like an illusion, right? The executive conscious self is something like an illusion. But also the boundary between you and other things becomes less and less sharp the more science we know. Crudely put, take a magnifying glass, then a microscope, and then an electron microscope, and look at the border of your body in the outside environment, and you'll see it become hazier and hazier and hazier, right? But then you get into like quantum physics and string theory, and we're all just kind of epiphenomena. Which means we are something like the downstream consequence of something much more fundamental, right? Mm-hmm. The movement of strings or something like that. And we're nothing more substantial than that. And Wright says, well, look, science has therefore verified the two of the main traditional Buddhist claims about us and our surroundings. One is called not self in English, and one's called emptiness. Not self is the claim that the self is an illusion, right? And emptiness is this claim that somehow nothing that seems like it's really substantial, the things that really look like they exist, turns out they're all insubstantial. They're hazy, they're not well defined. They're basically, in some sense, unreal. And that's the first claim. Science has substantiated Buddhism's diagnosis of our situation. The second claim is that we systematically engage in harmful patterns of behavior because of this situation we find ourselves in. We running away from the fact that life is meaningless and empty, and that we're not really real, and that the self is an illusion. We run away from the realization of these facts into really unhealthy places. And says Wright, we know from robust scientific experimentation that the practices of mindfulness, of Buddhist mindfulness, help to recalibrate the self in ways that are less destructive. It gets you off the hedonic treadmill. It brings you a certain amount of peace with the fact that you aren't actually real, and that and that yourself is just an illusion. You get a type of peace. Now, just very quickly to show how this could be an argument for a certain type of Hinduism, and then I imagine you'll ask me where I think the argument might fail. Is there's a certain type of Hinduism called Advaita Vedanta. It's not perhaps the most popular form of Hinduism, but it's a very intellectual tradition and a very important tradition in Hinduism, it believes that there is a self, and it believes that the world is real. So in those respects, it's different to Buddhism. But it also thinks that ultimately we are all part of a larger self, and that larger self is more fundamentally real. It's like the real, right? And that's Brahman, which is kind of the monotheistic god at the kind of the head of Hindu kind of, or the foundation of Hindu ontology. So in one excerpt, which I'll just read from you, Wright says, well, maybe the deepest meditative experiences had by Buddhists and the deepest meditative experiences had by Hindus in the Advaita Vedanta tradition are basically the same experience. There is a sense of dissolution of the bound of self and an ensuing sense of continuity with everything else outside of you. If you're a Buddhist, at least a Buddhist of the Main Street type, you're encouraged to think of this as a continuity of emptiness. You are like me, I like the table, I like this cup, I like the computer, in that we're all not really real. Whereas the Hindu is encouraged to think of it as a continuity of spirit. We're all just local manifestations of the same underlying spirit, right? Brahman. But it's ultimately the same, an experience of the same thing, vindicated by the same scientific findings. So that's the argument that Wright puts forward for Buddhism. And right at the end of his book, he says, maybe it's an argument for a form of Hinduism too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll try to be brief. Where do you think there are some good objections to this argument?
So the first objection is kind of global. It says, okay, let's accept that Buddhism and Hinduism were true about these facts. It doesn't seem necessarily enough to me. Certainly to make it the case that Buddhism is exclusively true in a way that makes it the case that Christianity isn't true. Right? Okay, so maybe Buddhism's right, that there's some sense that in the deep ontology, there's no real distinction between you and me, whatever. That doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't Messiah, the Son of God. It just means we need to analyze the ontology here differently, right? I think there have been Christians in history who've been panentheist, who thought that all of us are in some sense a part of God, which seems similar to the claim that Wright is attributing to this particular school of Hinduism. So the first point I want to make is the conclusion, even if we accept it, isn't perhaps as strong a conclusion as we're looking for in this chapter. We're looking for kind of one religion as opposed to others. And it looks like what Wright's giving us are certain insights from a religion that don't necessarily entail, even if they're true, that we should all jump ship.
Yeah, I mean, the gist of the argument, if it would be something like the doctrine of no self and emptiness is true. That's premise one. Premise two, if the doctrine of no self and emptiness is true, then Buddhism or perhaps this form of Hinduism is true.
Yeah.
Right. And you're saying two is questionable. Even if those things are true, it doesn't strictly entail that Buddhism or Hinduism is true.
Exactly. And that's because I think any Buddhist or Hindu reading this book will definitely agree with me, is that Wright is kind of very, very reductive as to what Buddhism and Hinduism are. Buddhism and Hinduism make many, many more claims, not just these two claims. And Wright knows that. He calls his a westernized, secularized form of Buddhism. I just think that you've taken out the religious heart and soul of Buddhism and of Hinduism if this is all you've got left. And sure, this kernel of Hinduism or Buddhism that's proven true by the argument, if the argument works, it could be true, but not in a way that's threatening to other religions. And to the extent that we think that at most one religion is true, this argument isn't helpful. You might be a religious pluralist, and in the book I talk about pluralism as well. You might think more than one religion could have some sort of claim on truth. Fine, but in this chapter we're looking for something more exclusivist, and I just don't think it gives you that. But I also think he's too confident about the science and what it teaches. I think the science is very clear that mindfulness is good for us. It's just the data is undeniable. Mindfulness can be good for us. I point out, and I think this is so important, it's a really lovely case of when philosophers appeal to science, but then don't keep up to date on the science, right? So I cite an article by Lardone. Oh, no, sorry, one second. I'll tell you where. Oh, Golipur. I cite an article by Golipur from The Atlantic, some newspaper, but reporting in 2019 that even the people who designed the Libet experiments, those who've survived, some have died since, have recognized that the experiment was poorly designed. And they redid the experiments without the design flaw. And it was what's the word? Vividly found that once the experiment is run without the design flaw, we can't find any time lag whatsoever between the brain making a decision and the conscious experience of making the decision. So Wright is taking this science experiment that was done, many decades ago, as proof that there's no conscious mind, when actually, or the conscious mind doesn't really have an executive function, or that it's somehow a late development. No, actually, up-to-date neuroscience has shown that experiment was badly designed, and so I think he's placing far too much weight. Ironically, I actually think, I'm not a materialist. You won't be surprised to discover, and therefore, I don't think that your conscious mind can be reduced to, or even supervenes purely upon your neurology. I even think some of the experiments around Buddhist mindfulness help us to recognize how significant consciousness really is, because what some of the science has uncovered about, or seems to have uncovered about mindfulness, is that certain mindful exercises can have an effect upon neurological structures that are very deep in the brain, including the very structures that materialists tend to point to as the seat of consciousness. So that's to say, by using your conscious mind, you can change the structure of the parts of your brain which are supposed to be responsible for consciousness itself, right? Which to me is, at least prima facie evidence that there is something non-physical going on, when the conscious mind meets the brain. So I just think the science is too quickly relied upon in places, or unthoroughly understood in other places. So I don't think it's a fabulous argument. I am sure that there are better arguments to be made for both Hinduism and Buddhism. And if anything, I'd like the book to encourage people in the Buddhist or Hindu traditions who think analytic philosophy is the way to think rigorously, to present their arguments accordingly. And there are some, in the University of Birmingham right now, there's a project in global philosophy, and it has a Hindu postdoc. And I know there's a lot of work going on in Indian philosophy, but it just often isn't Indian philosophy of religion. But there is great analytic Indian philosophy happening. So my hope is that down the line, we'll see something better than what I was able to put forward in this book. But it was a sample.
Yeah. All right. Well, since we're coming up on an hour and a half, I think what I will do is I'll wrap it up there. You end the chapter by saying, here's how you could go about arguing for any religion. And the structure of that argument is closely connected to Pascal's wager.
That's right.
Though it's not, I appreciated that you said this, it's not original. That kind of reasoning is not original to Pascal. It goes back, I think you said, to Al-Ghazali. Yeah. So that I learned something there. But I have an entire playlist of videos going through Pascal's book, Taking Pascal's Wager. I've interviewed Liz Jackson multiple times.
She's a
so
star.
People will be familiar with Pascal.
Let me just say in a nutshell is that if people are interested, I have a paper called Pascal Berg and Friends, right? And you can check it out. It's in the International Journal for Philosophy of Religion. There's an open access pre-publication version on my website, samlebens.com. But the idea is I have a version of Pascal's wager, which basically says that most Christians are rationally mandated to take the wager for Christianity, and that culturally Christian people, right? And that most culturally Hindu people are actually mandated by very similar reasoning to take the wager for Hinduism. The most similarly located cultural Jews are similarly mandated by the wager to wager on Judaism. The complicated question comes, if I really believe that's true, why did God create a world in which people are rationally mandated to follow different religions based upon the evidence they've been exposed to and the cultural scenarios into which they're born? That's an interesting question for a different time.
Yeah, I'll have to check that paper out. That sounds great.
Sure.
All right. So let me say first, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank
I really
you.
enjoyed it.
Me too.
And I hope to have you on again if you're open to that.
That would be my pleasure, Jordan.
So now for the viewer, if you sat through this whole thing, you're awesome. This was a long interview. I hope that you found it really beneficial. And if you did, if you enjoyed this entire interview, I know that you're going to love reading this book. So here's how you can go about winning a free copy. Here's what you need to do. 2 steps. Step 1, any platform you want. If you want to share it on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, some social media platform, share this interview, and then I want you to email me at theanalyticchristian@gmail.com. That's my email address on the screen. Send me an email. I'm going to take your word for it that you really did share it. If you want to prove it to me, you're free to send in a screenshot or something, but I'm going to take your word for it that you shared it. And just say, I shared it on social media. If you want to include your mailing address, you may. That way I can reply and say, you're the winner. I've sent the book out. But I'm going to I'm not going to accept any more emails about this after November 1st. So 1st of November, this offer ends, and I'm going to pick 2 winners and send you a copy of the book.
Perfect.
All right.
Gordon, thank you so much.
Thank you again. I really enjoyed it.
Me too. It's lovely to meet you.
Keep exploring Christianity. See you next time. And Judaism.